Due Process, winner of 19 regional Emmy Awards, including the 2010 New York Emmy for our coverage of voting rights, and the 2011 Mid-Atlantic Emmy for Outstanding Discussion Series. Due Process is a presentation of Rutgers School of Law, Newark, and the Edward J. Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy. Studio facilities provided by the Rutgers ITV Studio, Division of Continuing Studies.
It was a profound decision, so profound, I doubt it will ever be replicated again. It was a one-off response to a very unique tragedy in American history.
He was the man in charge of who got what as compensation for 9/11, the pay-czar for corporate titans under TARP, and now the government-appointed chief of the $20 billion BP Gulf Disaster Fund. Ken Feinberg, how does one lawyer shoulder such daunting roles? Just one of our questions for this Feinberg edition of Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process provided by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law, and by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy.
He's been called the master of disasters, the special master in some of this country's most daunting, most difficult questions of who should be compensated in the wake of disaster and to what extent. He's been the man put in charge of who gets what over and over again. From vets with health destroyed by Agent Orange to the dead and injured of 9/11 and the victims of the BP explosion in the Gulf. So when Ken Feinberg came to Rutgers Law School to speak to students, it was a rare opportunity for us to find out what goes into such tough decisions, the calculations and the consequences. Feinberg was there for the annual Paul Miller lecture, so we asked Paul Miller why Feinberg had been chosen.
Well, that they would get the opportunity to meet someone of his stature and reputation and see that he's an individual just like they are, a lawyer just like they're going to be, but has brought to bear something entirely new. And that is what we hope that they will be doing.
We got a sense of what he meant when Feinberg sat down with Raymond just before the Miller lecture.
Ken Feinberg, welcome to Due Process.
Thank you.
In the interest of journalistic disclosure, let me tell our viewers that you and I have known each other for a number of years. We serve on the board of a very fine human rights organization called Human Rights First.
Correct.
Let me sort of recap a little bit of your history, because you've been in an interesting space that sort of intersects between the law and public policy. You were involved as a special master in settling the Agent Orange case. Now, we're in a law school, and it strikes me that most of the students won't have a clue about Agent Orange. But the short version of it is that it was the settlement of a case that involved a toxin that had been used in Vietnam and that it affected many GIs, or at least that was the contention. And it was really the first mass tort litigation. And it's an important part of your history, and we're going to come back to it. But we go from there to 9/11, where you were the special master in charge of the Victims' Compensation Fund, which was a huge undertaking, about which we're going to spend some time. But you also were involved in giving advice and being involved at Virginia Tech after the shooting that took place there. In connection with the TARP, you were called the Pay-czar, which is an interesting title, having to do with executive compensation. And most recently, from our point of view, you've been involved with the fund that's connected to the BP disaster in the Gulf. So we're going to talk about all of those things, but a starting point might be, now you were a volunteer in 9/11, but when you first assumed responsibility for that task, did you have a sense of the enormity of the task you were undertaking?
Yes, I think in 9/11 we all did in this country. I stepped up. I was asked by the Attorney General of the United States to take on that assignment. 11 days after 9/11, Congress decided, one, we better divert people away from lawsuits which will threaten the financial viability of the airline industry, afraid to fly after 9/11, but also let's come to the aid of our fellow citizens in need who lost loved ones on 9/11 or were horribly disfigured by the disaster, and let's provide public compensation, tax-free compensation to those who choose to go that route.
Now, there are two aspects of that decision made by the Congress that I think are important. One is it's a profound decision to say that the system that we've had in place for a couple of hundred years, and it's been tweaked, and it has been dealing increasingly as of 2001 with mass torts, is not going to be useful in this situation. That's a profound decision, and I'm not sure that the body politic spent a lot of time debating that, although I know the airlines and some interested persons were involved.
Well, I think that's right. It was a profound decision, so profound, I doubt it will ever be replicated again. I don't think that the 9/11 fund posed any great threat to the traditional, conventional legal system in our country. It was a one-off response to a very unique tragedy in American history.
Now, going in, there was no limit on the amount of money that you would be able to administer. What criteria did the Congress give you in order to determine, especially in death cases, who gets paid? And by the way, I think New Jersey had the second largest number of victims from any other state. But what were the criteria?
Well, as you point out, Congress debated this at great length for one day. There were no hearings. Congress decided that there ought to be a fund, and Congress said the fund should replicate the existing tort system. So the special master shall calculate damages based on economic loss, what judges and juries do every day in New Jersey and everywhere else in this country, non-economic loss, pain and suffering, emotional distress, and then Congress, trying to sort of limit the extent of these public payments, said that the special master shall deduct from economic loss and non-economic loss collateral sources of income, like life insurance arising out of the deaths. And there's your formula.
But let me go back to the title of your book and something I've always wondered about, that the value of a life is largely measured in economic terms. How much would the dependents have been deprived of because of that loss? Did it trouble you that in a situation that had so many overtones, political, psychological, spiritual, as you deal with in the book, that you're tethered to this notion of essentially what income would that person have thrown off during a lifetime?
Absolutely, it was troublesome. But first, if Congress is really trying to divert people out of the tort system voluntarily, you have to pay more to the stockbroker and the banker and the lawyer and the hedge fund operator.
But let me stop you right there. How can one look the mother of a busboy in the eye, or his wife, or his 3 children, and say, there is some way in which we measure your loss differently than a stockbroker?
First of all, judges and juries, as you know, Raymond, do that every day for 200 years in every court, in every village, hamlet, and city in this country. The problem with 9/11 was the collective focus on a basket of 7,300 applications, of which 5,300 were found to be eligible. And everybody, it's human nature, everybody counts other people's money. So you're right. In the 9/11 context, the busboy, the waiter, the soldier, the cop, the fireman, versus the hedge fund manager, the stockbroker, the banker, and there is inherent inequality in the economic circumstances surrounding those calculations.
Now, there's something that you repeat a number of times in your book, and I'm not pushing your book, but I think it's an interesting read.
My supply of my book is virtually inexhaustible.
Okay, good. But let me go back to something that you admit to in the book, and while I like the outcome, I'm not comfortable with the process. That you did some flattening, that as you used your discretion so that you didn't want, and some of this was on the advice of Ted Kennedy, which I'm sure you'll share with us, so that you didn't have a runaway disparity between the stockbrokers at the other end and a private or a PFC or a busboy at the other end.
Senator Kennedy said to me, this is public money. Make sure that 15% of the claimants don't receive 85% of the public's money, it won't sit well with the public.
So let me take you back to what you said a couple of minutes ago, that in some ways the methodology you used was the same methodology that's used in courtrooms around the country. But you did something that you probably couldn't get away with in a courtroom and a judge couldn't do, which is to say, I'm going to equalize some of this because there's a public money and a public policy and public scrutiny that won't permit most of the money to go to the wealthy in a way that's disparate. The average was 2 million and the mean was 1.7 million.
That's right.
So you did a lot of flattening.
Yes.
So I like
or
the
raising.
result. Okay, but that gave you an enormous amount of discretion.
Too much discretion. The Congress, at the end of the day, not sure what this would cost or how it would work, basically at the bottom of the statute said, and after you consider all these other specific variables, the special master shall exercise his discretion to see that justice is done. And ultimately, I was delegated that responsibility.
Now, in every one of the tasks that you've undertaken, some of them like this one pro bono, some of them for pay, you've received a fair amount of criticism. Was there any criticism during the time or subsequent to the 9/11 task that really stung you more than others? Was there one? But is there any particular one that you thought was either unfair or one that really didn't go to what you did but went to the structure of the system?
The fireman's widow, I mentioned in the book, the fireman's widow in Manhattan, in a public meeting, who jumped up, and when she learned that the banker or the stockbroker was going to get twice as much as she was going to get for the death of her husband, a hero at the World Trade Center, publicly chastised me and said, I spit on your children, and I think what you're doing is terrible. It's compounding 9/11. You should be ashamed. That gets to you. I don't care what your backbone or how much backbone you have. When a widow is publicly rebuking you for following the statute, it's difficult.
If you could retroactively be a member of Congress, if we could put you back in a time machine, put you in Congress and give you some influence in that rather large unwieldy body, would you change anything about that statute in order to avoid that very outcome?
Give everybody the same amount of money and let those who want to sue, sue, and those who don't want to sue the airlines, don't sue. But in a rather unique example, Congress decided to replicate the tort system and give everybody a different amount of money, thereby fueling the very divisiveness and the very argument that the statute was designed to prevent.
And of course, it says something about what happens when Congress makes laws about complex situation under tremendous pressure. And without adequate deliberation, which is not an unknown phenomenon, but is one of the things that seems to have affected this effort.
I think if Congress had thought about this 2 more weeks, it wouldn't have done it. Either they wouldn't have had any fund. I mean, you should have read some of my emails. Mr. Feinberg, my son died in Oklahoma City. Where's my check? My daughter died in the basement of the World Trade Center in the original 1993 attacks committed by the very same people. Why aren't I eligible? Either Congress wouldn't have done it at all using public money, or, I think, Congress would have been well advised to give everybody the same amount of money and let those who want to sue, sue.
One of the intriguing things, and maybe this is helpful to students, is that some of the things that you get a chance to do as a lawyer, and I'm sure this is true of other crafts and professions, are not things for which you are prepared by your formal training. So when we talk about allocation of loss, or we talk about deep economic questions, which even right now, as we speak, are roiling the body politic, I don't know that your law school training was especially geared to that, but take your assignment as the paymaster with respect to the TARP, where you're looking at executive compensation. And again, you're under the, shall we say, the close scrutiny of the entire body politic, which is saying, we've loaned money to these financial institutions, and these guys and gals are taking these huge payments. This is not right. And in that context, while you're looking at technical issues and criteria, you're also aware, are you not, that the whole body politic is challenging one of the assumptions of our whole culture, which is, what do we do about redistributing wealth and deciding who gets what?
That statute was another aberration. It'll never be replicated. First, Congress bailed out companies so they wouldn't go belly up. Then, in what I call sort of populist revenge, they decided, as a symbolic gesture primarily, to have the government that kept these folks in business fix the pay of the top 25 officials at 7 companies. That's 175 people, that's all. Let's send a message. And that's what that was all about.
Well, I get the sense from your tone that you really didn't like the provision pursuant to which you were retained to do the job.
I don't think anybody, I didn't mind the provision. I'm asked to do a job. It's the rule of law.
But it sounds like you don't think it made a lot of sense.
I don't think it made much sense as a practical matter.
What about its impact on the marketplace? I mean, some people have argued that less important than what you did in some instances, actually rolling back or clawing back pay, was to send a message about corporate governance that might be useful. You think, or is that just a rationalization for what really wasn't a very useful idea?
If you want to reform corporate governance or you want to have an impact on executive pay across the board, not just 7 companies, take a look at Dodd-Frank, the Federal Reserve, the SEC, Secretary Geithner in the G20, Sheila Bair at the FDIC. That's where you're going to see more pervasive long-term impact on governance and on pay, not this, what the New York Times called this sideshow involving 175 people at 7 companies.
Well, you could have chosen not to do that. Why did you do it if your own analysis was that in the scheme of things, it really wasn't going to have a long-term impact and it was sort of a populist spasm?
No, I think still it's a challenge. It's the law of the land. You try saying no to the Secretary of the Treasury, who's asked you to take on an assignment. You willingly take it on. You do the best you can. You hope that maybe it will have an impact. You're not doing this purely as a preview or as a fun undertaking. It was a lot of work. It took 16 months. And I think we got some very good results. You're asking what will be the long-term pervasive impact across the board in American society. That I'm not so sure about.
But let's move on to another one which might be interesting. You wind up down in BP after the Deepwater Horizon, administering a fund, which has some complexity about it. And in fact has been the subject of, unfamiliar territory to you, challenges, legal challenges, and one senator who has, I would say, written some letters about you that are pretty vitriolic. But at the end of the day, you did that. In this case, you're being compensated. And the size of your compensation, or at least the gross size of your compensation, has been in all the newspapers, from $800,000 to $1.2 million. So a month, those are big numbers. And the question was raised about whether or not you were truly independent of BP. And a court actually decided that you were not neutral but independent. At the end of the day, it seems a very complex set of circumstances that got you to BP.
It's very complex. You can ask yourself again, just as with the 9/11 fund, just as with the Paymaster, is this sound public policy? Now in BP, the President of the United States and his administration sat down with BP and shook hands. Unprecedented. BP agreed, coming out of the White House.
But they were both on the ropes because there was public criticism of the extent to which the government hadn't protected the environment and of the extent to which BP had not been a responsible corporate.
You say on the ropes. I know of no similar situation in American
criticized
history.
is what I mean by that metaphor.
BP fronted $20 billion.
But do you agree that they were on the ropes, that there was huge public criticism of both the White House and BP?
No, I don't agree with that.
They weren't being criticized roundly?
BP was. I'm not sure the Obama administration was being criticized.
There wasn't criticism?
It's a blow-up, an explosion.
But there were questions about whether there had been shortcuts taken in connection with the process of
the fact
approving
of the fact of the matter is, again, in a rather unprecedented way, BP walked out of the White House and agreed to bypass the part, at least, of the court system and to front $20 billion to pay all legitimate claims arising out of the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. I know of no similar situation in American history. Exxon Valdez, they've been litigating for over 20 years. They're still litigating. And here is BP fronting $20 billion and agreeing to appoint somebody other than one of their own people to design and administer the claims program.
Now, the plaintiffs, some of the plaintiffs in that action went to the judge who is supervising a large part of the litigation and said, well, he's not really completely free of BP. He's really an agent of BP. And the court took sort of a middle ground, said, no, he's not an agent of BP, but he is a person who has to be governed in some ways by certain rules about what he tells people. Why were they critical of your role if there was this huge fund available for short-term and medium-term relief?
I think they were critical for 2 reasons. One, no matter how much of an aberration the oil spill fund might be, like 9/11, it is still perceived in good faith as a threat to the traditional litigation system and the system that we all study in law school. It is out-of-the-box thinking. It is a threat. Secondly, I think the lawyers were upset with some of my public pronouncements, which I think, in retrospect, I might have been a little bit more measured in some of the things I said. But I think for both of those reasons, some of the lawyers active in the litigation in New Orleans were critical of the whole program.
Now, this question of criticism is interesting. My experience is that you're a pretty forthright guy, but also that you're a sensitive human being. Why would you continue to subject yourself to circumstances where even if you do the best you can, and even if you get what you think are some pretty good results, you are going to be excoriated? Because over the last few days, I've been Googling your name, as I have not in the past, because I can always call you, talk to you. And I'm saying, look at all these people saying these things about Ken. And as I said, one United States Senator who has been personal, ad hominem, and really gone after you. What's the upside for subjecting yourself to that, especially since you can't always answer these criticisms?
First of all, if it isn't the Secretary of the Treasury or the Attorney General of the United States, it's the President of the United States. You're called on to perform a very public role. It's not easy to turn down roles like that if you're asked to do it as a citizen. Secondly, you hope that there are hundreds and thousands of people and elected officials around the country who have a lot of confidence in your ability to do it. So if one senator or one congressman or one mayor or one local elected official is going to go after you barrels blazing, this guy's not independent, he's in the tank for BP, he's not independent, etc. There are thousands of others that are saying, do the best you can. We understand
There's
how
an old
difficult
folk saying, forewarned is forearmed, which brings me back to where I'd promised we would go for the benefit of the youth, which is Agent Orange. And there were some causation issues, but I think a widespread popular belief that toxins used in an herbicide had caused massive harm to many GIs. And here you have mass tort litigation, and you get inserted as really a special master. In that context, there were results that disappointed some. 20,000 really per person was about the amount, which for people who were horribly disabled, that was a relatively modest amount. Everybody was moderately disgruntled?
I think that's right. Vietnam veterans who have a sense of expectation, having served in the jungles of Vietnam, survived that war, but been harmed by their own Air Force and chemical companies that manufactured Agent Orange, they should receive full compensation. And you're never going to be able to satisfy expectation of people, innocent people, harmed through no fault of their own. You do the best you can.
In a sense, you've had a very fine education post-law school, one that couldn't have been purchased anywhere, given your involvement in these circumstances. To law students and to young folks, what would you say about what they can do in terms of getting exposed to these issues and preparing themselves to deal with them should the opportunity arise?
First thing I would tell law students, I tell my own law students when I teach, don't plan too far ahead with your resume. Like you said earlier, Raymond, who would have thought that I would have entered a career like this? And I tell law students, especially students at really good law schools like Rutgers, you think you can plan well into the future. Where will I be 5 years from now? If I go to a law firm now, will I be able to do something else later, or vice versa? Go with your heart's desire. Go where you want to go. Don't worry too much. Life has a way of changing your best expectations and your best blueprint. And you ought to take that as a philosophic sense of where you may end up.
Going with your heart's desire sounds like a good piece of advice on which to end this conversation. Thanks for sharing your special insight into the interstitial space between the law and public policy. Ken, thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Ken Feinberg, a super lawyer who so often finds himself in uncharted territory, setting new ways of dealing with disaster, bringing his wit and wisdom to us at Due Process. It's the kind of discussion you won't easily find elsewhere, so we urge you to join us next week and every week for our unique look at law, public policy, and justice. Till then, won't you friend us at facebook.com/DueProcessTV and watch our new and old programs at youtube.com/DueProcessTV. For Raymond and all of us here at Due Process, I'm Sandra King.
fireman's widow in Manhattan in a public meeting who jumped up, and when she learned that the banker or the stockbroker was going to get twice as much as she was going to get for the death of her husband, a hero at the World Trade Center, publicly chastised me and said, I spit on your children, and I think what you're doing is terrible. It's compounding 9/11. You should be ashamed. That gets to you. I don't care what your backbone or how much backbone you have. When a widow is publicly rebuking you for following the statute, it's difficult.
Major funding for due process provided by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law, and by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy.